here today with Tyler Roberts, Professor of Religious Studies at Grinnell College. We're here in New Haven today for a consultation on the future of theology, conceived rather broadly.
Good.
Tyler, if I may.
Yeah.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, Tyler, you're in an interesting kind of posture for this conversation. You begin your paper for today by reminding us that you are neither a theologian nor a Christian, yet you also aren't merely a distant observer of Christian theology either. You have some appreciative kind of readings from the outside. And so you have this really, actually a fantastic vantage point, I think, for on what is happening in Christian theology and in its reception in various communities within the academy and elsewhere. So we're going to talk a lot about the future, but why don't we start with the present? As you see it, kind of what's going right in Christian theology and its reception? What's going well?
Well, I think it's a little hard for me to make general statements about the state of Christian theology. I think that what I read in the manifesto about a crisis that's both internal and external makes a lot of sense to me. And maybe I can speak more knowledgeably about the external crisis, because I have thought a lot about that as a scholar of religious studies and someone who's very interested in how we have come to use this term religion over a long period of time, and how particularly we use this in an academic setting. And it's very clear that it's impossible to talk about how we use this term religion in an academic setting without also talking about how we use the term theology, because a lot of scholars like to distinguish what they do as scholars of religion by saying it's not theology. And so in that context, I think that what the manifesto refers to as the external crisis hits the mark very well, as far as I can see. In the simple fact that I don't think people really read Christian theology, and even scholars of religion who talk about it, I read their stuff and I think, you got to read more. What you're calling theology doesn't sound like a lot of the theology I read. The way you describe theology as a discipline, the kinds of things that it tries to do, the kinds of presuppositions it works with, doesn't ring true to me. And so I think that in that sense, Christian theology is in some real trouble. And I think that those of us who consider ourselves to be scholars of religion, scholars of Christianity, historians of Christianity, people just interested in what religion is, we really dropped the ball. And it's not just up to the theologians, it's also up to us to think about this in some different ways.
So for you, it would seem, from a religious studies point of view, theology can be data for you.
Yes.
That seems like no problem. No one's going to have a problem with that. You should be able to pick up any Christian theologian and do your critical thing to it.
Yes.
But you don't think that's a kind of rich enough interaction.
Well, I think it's an absolutely necessary interaction. I mean, I think that Christian theology, like any other religious phenomenon, is something scholars of religion need to study, can be critical of, can look at from all sorts of different angles, and that's interesting. It's valuable. It's important.
It's even helpful to the church to have that sort of external critique.
Right. I think absolutely. However, I just think that in doing that, we are responsible as scholars of religion for looking at this phenomenon from as many different angles and as richly and finely as we possibly can. And it just seems to me that way too often that theology as a discipline or particular theological efforts are not looked at that way. They become straw men or women for pursuing some other project. They are not engaged as a voice that is not just a religious phenomenon, but is also a critically engaged and reflective religious phenomenon, which means that it can speak across some of these boundaries that people set up, and too often we don't engage it that way.
So what are some of the things that theology is saying or could be saying if one were to listen to folks outside, right, to folks maybe in religious studies?
Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, I think that just very basically, and here the line between theology as data and theology as something else is pretty blurry, but I think that when you engage theology in a rich way, you can see how religious people come to their ideas, defend their ideas in a very self-critical way. That is, I read theology as a deeply self-critical discipline, and some of the theologians that I really enjoy engaging seem to me to be as thoughtful and as careful in their work as any other scholar. So that's one thing. What are certain kinds of Christians thinking? And I can also use theology more broadly, because this can come out of other kinds of this kind of thinking can come out of other religious traditions as well. More interestingly for me, I think, is how those of us in religious studies, perhaps the academy more broadly, can learn how to think from theologians, can learn how to engage the world in certain ways from theologians. One of the things that I find particularly important here is, and we talked about this just a minute ago, this idea of what I'm calling critical assent. I think that far too often, and I say this as a scholar that thinks about my work in religious studies very much as a humanistic discipline or effort. And far too often in the humanities, when we try to think critically about various things, we're very good at raising questions, we're very good at leveling various kinds of critique, and we're not so good at articulating constructive, even normative positions on the things we study. And I think that's part of our job. And I think, of course, we have to do that as academics in a critical fashion. And I think theology has something to teach us there about how you engage the world, how you take normative positions in an informed and self-critical way.
Because that seems to be a kind of either or often in the scholarly community, is the assumption in academia, in religious studies, which I did my PhD, there is this, it's an either or. Either you're going to be critical, which means entirely deconstructive or something like this, and you have this kind of culture of negation only. It's hard to say anything constructive. Or you think, or you're on the flip side of that, where you're just credulous and you'll believe anything. And but yeah, you see in the conduct of theology a model for how to blaze some sort of middle road.
We talk about things, and I'm speaking from someone who works with mostly secular undergraduates in a liberal arts context. And when I talk to many of these students about religion, when I talk to them about faith, when I talk to them about religious commitments and positions, it very often gets very quickly reduced down to blind faith. And use the word credulous, and that religious people are credulous, perhaps in a way that that others are not. And I think one of the things we can learn in reading Christian theology is that this is silly. That really what theology does at its best, as far as I'm concerned, is to chart out ways and to reflect on the ways that we come to our commitments, we come to our normative positions, we come to our beliefs through rigorous thinking, through certain kinds of practice, and that there's nothing particularly blind or credulous in the pejorative sense about this. And so I find it very useful in my own work as a teacher to try to show students this and to talk to students about how they come to their own positions and how we can talk about these things and take these positions, make these claims in a educated and thoughtful way.
So we spent some time talking about kind of a way of correcting perhaps a misconception of theology and what it's up to. But it seems to me in your paper for today and in your writings, you also have a concern that there's actually something broken in the way that we conduct humanities.
Yes.
That theology can actually help
Right.
fix. There's a kind of reigning hermeneutics of suspicion that again has its place, is appropriate, but it's not quite enough. Can you talk about that challenge within humanities?
Well, I'll start by saying when it comes to things like the hermeneutics of suspicion, that on one level I'm all for it. I wrote my first book on Nietzsche. I am a great admirer of people like Nietzsche and the critical resources they have brought to us. But again, I'll speak out of my work as a teacher. And it's almost ironic, I guess, that when I talk to a lot of my students, and particularly students who, let's say, are in their third or fourth year at Grinnell College, who may be religious studies majors, maybe English majors, maybe sociology majors, and one of the things that they've done in these disciplines is they have learned a certain way of thinking critically very well. And I can give them a book by a theologian or a philosopher, and they're very good at pointing to its limitations, pointing to its social location, pointing to its assumptions, raising questions about gender, raising questions about class, and they are very important questions that they raise, and they're very, very good at this.
And that'll get them into a good graduate program.
And it'll get them into a good graduate program. But I want something more from them, and I want them to be able not only to point to these things, but number one, I want them to be able to say, okay, once we have seen this, what else can we say about what this person is talking about? How can we engage their ideas in ways that make you think about your own life? And how can you get into a conversation with this person, with this text, in ways that are going to not only confirm your critical perspectives, but challenge you in certain ways, to rethink, maybe not them necessarily, but to rethink where you are in your life and what you're committed to. And that's a much harder task. And it's one that many students, I find, are not always that comfortable with. And so, we spoke a minute about credulity. And what I find very often is that these students have taken on these certain critical tools in a way that is somewhat credulous, in that it's their first reaction and they have not questioned those methods of engaging texts. And they're somewhat narrow in their approach to these texts. And so what I want to do with them is not dismiss any of that work at all, but to open up other ways of engaging with these texts, with these people, with each other, in ways that will allow them to speak in a more constructive and positive way about their commitments. And I guess a long way of getting back to the specifics of your question, the education they're getting that brings them to my class in this way, I think, is in some respects, a very good humanities education, but it's not enough for the humanities. And I think that what we need to do is to be teaching students to engage with our cultural traditions, to engage with all sorts of human phenomena in a way that allows them to think about themselves and uses that engagement to rethink where they are in the world and what they're bringing to it.
And that seems at a certain level what the American idea of college is for, right? This is part of what should be happening, is asking students, giving them opportunity, equipping them to ask and answer well the big questions of life, the human questions of life.
I would like it to be for that, and I know it's been that for some people at some points in time, and probably still is for others. And there are a lot of books out there that talk about this, and that would agree with what you just said, and I think I completely agree with it. It's hard. It's hard for a variety of reasons, I think, to do that. Even at a place like Grinnell College, which very much, in its mission statement, will say things about preparing students for life and engaging the life of the mind, and I think for a variety of reasons, for when you talk to individual professors or when you look at departments articulating their curricula, it becomes hard to know, I think, how to take on some of these big questions. Or it's not hard, but what we do is we take them on historically. We look at how others have talked about the big questions, but we don't necessarily prepare students to engage with them themselves. All of us, again, a place like Grinnell, where it's not a research school, although research is important, but teaching is the number one priority for faculty. But we've all been trained at places like Yale. We've all been trained as specialists in particular disciplines. We've all been trained in a context where the job market is so tough that what you have to do before you land your first job is publish. It's not just publishing to get tenure, it's publishing to get that first job. And establishing your credentials as an academic and as a specialist. And all of that, I think, makes it difficult to think of yourself primarily as a teacher of undergraduates. At a place like Grinnell, which gets very high caliber students, there is a tendency to want to train them as for graduate school. And so all these factors, I think, make it very hard for faculty, even in places like Grinnell, to say, okay, how are we going to talk about some of these big questions? How are we going to prepare students, not so much for graduate school, but to be thoughtful contributors to visions of life?
Is the question of truth one of the problems there? Sometimes we wonder, because part of what the third person historicizing move does for you is Gadamer says, right, the text which is read historically is prevented or is forced to abandon its claim to be saying something true, which for Gadamer, the way he's phrased it, that's a lamentable move. But if truth is the thing you're trying to avoid, it's actually a quite useful move. You can kind of pull all the truth out of it by just asking historical questions about it. You talk about reading, the humanities ought to be about reading these texts to figure out what's not just what was true for them, but what is true for me. And I suppose I've always wondered when I read that, is that a way of starting to talk about what is just true universally, or
I'm not quite sure how I'm going to answer that question yet, but I know that as I answer it, I'll probably be avoiding the hard question there.
We'll talk about it more this afternoon then. That sounds fine.
But certainly, I think yes, reading things historically is one way of avoiding some of those hard questions. I think there are all sorts of ways that to go back to some of the things I was saying earlier, I think there are all sorts of methods we teach our students for engaging texts that can, one of the byproducts of those methods is we're not going to really worry too much about the truth claims they're making. I would at least want to say, I guess, that I would like to be able to teach my students, and I imagine the humanities as a place where we examine not just texts, but other forms of human creativity, human expression, in ways that allow us to see what kinds of claims they are making and to take those claims as real options for ourselves. Not necessarily that we have to buy into them at all, but that we have to engage in a way that they will pose a challenge to us in our own lives. And again, I don't know if that means sort of getting at big truth questions, but certainly what is true for my life? What kinds of claims am I making in my life? What kinds of commitments am I pursuing in my life? And how do those things make me think about those things? How do those things challenge me? How do those things lead me to think differently, or perhaps not, but at least give them the chance to do that? Whether that means I am claiming that what I do after in the course of this process leads me to get closer to the truth. Hopefully, maybe, but I'm not sure.
You have hope for such a thing.
Right, yeah, sure.
Hope is no small thing. It's a beautiful picture of what the humanities could look like within that sort of vision. And while you're talking about these questions of truth, of course we can't be entirely incredulous of these claims, because in a pluralistic context, we're going to see lots of these different sorts of claims next to each other. And I think we're going to start to figure out that they may have many shared insights, but they probably can't all be true at once. And so we'll have that sort of picture. So in this pluralistic context, which is the one we live in, and a good and fruitful and beautiful one, what is, as an outsider, what role do you see for Christian theology to play in this context?
Well, so maybe I'll be repeating myself. I see two ways. One is for Christian theology to be a site, whether we are talking about a university, whether we're talking about a liberal arts context, whether we're talking about some other context where different kinds of people are engaging with one another. Christian theologians speak out of their beliefs, their commitments, their truths, and in listening to them speak as people who don't necessarily share all or some of those beliefs and truths, we're hearing from a different form of life. And we need to learn about different forms of life. We need to be willing and able to think carefully with and about those forms of life. And Christian theology has a crucial role there, as do people speaking out of other faith traditions, other normative positions, out of secular contexts. And so if we're going to talk about a pluralistic conversation of sorts, Christian theology has an important role to play there. But the other thing I've been saying and will reiterate is that I do think that Christian theology and I'd say other forms of thinking with assent can teach those of us who have a much harder time taking normative positions, taking positive, normative, constructive positions, and have something to teach us about how we do this in a thoughtful way. And so we cannot we don't just learn what a Christian has to say. I think we can also learn what does someone who is able to think constructively and critically at the same time, how do they do that? And how can that help us learn how to do that?
That is a great vision. One can only hope that that's some of what the future of theology holds. Tyler, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. This was fun.